Big ideas start with a spark. At Tassi's, we use that spark to ignite the fire in ourselves and our kids. So with the trust we build and the knowledge we share, we can grow together and stand tall, creating opportunities to advance in business while setting an example for the next generation. Whether you are starting fresh in Portugal or expanding globally, we're here to support each other. This is more than a network. We are a community that sets the examples for the leaders of tomorrow.
You worked at a lot of amazing companies and you run marketing audits and help raise EBITDA across tons of industries. But I want to start off at Beamly, because at Beamly you made a bet on that it would shift from TV discovery more to social feeds. And then you're kind of doing the same thing at XEO now, betting on a cultural shift again with AI. I want to know, what's your framework for identifying these shifts and then being able to start a company within these gaps?
Yeah, so I've always been fascinated by consumer signals and kind of seeing how you can use those signals to observe and anticipate changes in consumer behavior. So back to Beamly, which was Z-Box at the beginning. And so it's interesting because people had stopped watching live TV. So you're kind of watching TV on a time-shifted basis, which seems even so anachronistic now. But essentially you had a bunch of TV networks that were saying, no one's watching live TV anymore. And so the whole kind of play was 84% of people at the time had a device while watching live TV. So you would have been on Twitter, now X, or kind of Meta or other. And so the whole play was, well, what if we could actually tie those two devices together? So actually kind of have complementary information around the TV show while watching it on your device. And so this is an observed consumer behavior that at scale could have meant that actually we could have brought more people back to live TV. So for example, when you're watching your favorite show like The Voice, you could vote on your favorite contestant from your device. Okay?
That's cool.
And so I think that's always fascinated me, is trying to like look at changing behaviors, because typically consumers are way ahead of businesses.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of definitely kind of an observation from those Beamly times, and also applies to XEO 360.
And where are you identifying those changes? Is it just people you're talking to, you're on Reddit, or I've seen a lot of people, like on Reddit, on LinkedIn, X, like just really trying to identify problems or shifts in consumer cultural changes?
Yeah, so I guess I've always kind of relied on both kind of quant and qual. So quant is where you're using consumer surveys or other ways at scale to kind of understand changes or patterns in consumer behavior. And then kind of qualitative is typically using interviews, discussions, focus groups or other, just to kind of put color on this. And so across most of my career, I've always kind of find that fascinating, is get into a market, meet some real people, meet some real consumers. What are they doing? How are they using a new device? Kind of how are they using, for example, TikTok or Insta or other, in ways that like for people, decision makers who tend to be older, go, I never understood this before.
Yeah.
And so those types of insights, that's how I've kind of like tapped into that to understand this change and what it could mean for businesses at scale.
And what type of cultural shifts are you looking at today or starting to notice with the new age of AI and in those industries as well?
Yeah, I think I mentioned on my panel, like you've got 3 billion people now using large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, etc. To put that in context, that is the populations of the EU, the US, and China combined, plus another billion. And so 3 billion, it's half the world's population has now adopted this technology. And what's fascinating for me is that pace of adoption is faster than adoption of the wheel, adoption of the internet, adoption of social, adoption of smartphones. This has happened at an unmatched pace. And I think therefore for me this is probably the single most disruptive change that's ever occurred in humanity. And the question becomes therefore is, what does that mean, right? What does that mean in terms of how people engage with technology, how they engage with each other? I did some research last year kind of looking at what I call AI intermediaries. So this kind of idea of having an AI companion, not just kind of at work, but also at home as well. And so you can imagine these digital threesomes, right? Where you have you, your partner, and a digital intermediary that's actually kind of like interpreting or providing advice, etc. And I think that this is definitely a space of change that is going to be massively disruptive, not just in work, but outside work as well.
I predict there's going to be a lot more products. I've noticed some products like that are like solace, and they're really focused on the psychology and almost acting like a therapist with AI and humans. And then there's also people just relying on LLMs, again, like ChatGPT, Claude, as more of those thought partners. Where are you kind of predicting that that's going to go?
It's hard to know. Actually, I just read that I think the adoption of character.ai is actually kind of like is greater now than Perplexity. So there's a bunch of, so character AI essentially is you can actually build your own avatar, your own AI companion. You can like describe the attributes that you want. And I think, if you take a broader view fertility rates are declining across like most of the Western world, China, etc. Obviously, if you speak to kind of Gen Zs or alphas, there's far less physical interaction with how you meet people. And so I think those coupled with AI companions is going to speak to a really dramatic shift that's going to start kicking in the next 5, 10, 15 years for how people engage with other humans. If you're not building that muscle, if you will, in terms of actually like speaking to someone who you've never met before, has a different kind of point of view of yours politically, it becomes harder to build that muscle later in life. And so I think this is an area that's going to be super interesting.
And as well with XEO, like it's focused a lot in AI and using that within the company. How are you staying on top of that? It's such a changing industry. Every day we have new companies popping up and new companies going down. How are you integrating that with your company?
Yeah, so actually it's funny because you asked about like how do you kind of like pull out these trends, and actually the LLMs themselves leave a bunch of footprints, meaning anytime you ask a query on ChatGPT, Gemini or other, typically there are sources at the bottom. Those citation sources, actually are where the LLM is drawing its recommendation from, right? And so what we're typically doing at XEO 360 is we are pushing thousands of queries on behalf of a brand like Red Bull, for example, and we are therefore auditing the responses of the LLM. And all of those citation sources are typically coming from Reddit, from YouTube, from Amazon, etc. And it says to a brand like Red Bull, these are the surfaces where the LLM's drawing its recommendations. If you want to grow your share and be recommended more often, that's where you need to spend your time. So you need to build the relevance of your content on Reddit, on YouTube, on those specific subreddits that are being quoted by the LLM, on those specific YouTube channels with those creators. And I think for me, a really interesting moment right now is there's almost like a kind of a asymmetry of information, meaning we're pinpointing YouTube creators or subreddits that are quite small in size, but are disproportionately influential in how the LLMs are using them. And so we're trying to point you around to say, go after that YouTube creator because they're small right now, but they're hugely influential in terms of citations from LLMs.
And how are you having to adapt the company as we have new LLMs popping up in new companies and they're drawing from new information, obviously ChatGPT with the ads now being integrated into the free version. How are you adapting the company to that?
Yeah, it's a question of really kind of looking where the majority of the usage is. And so there's a bunch of LLMs. And so, for example, in the past 12 months, Gemini has caught up massively with ChatGPT, but still ChatGPT with about 800 million, Gemini about 650, 700 million, AI overviews owned by Google, 2 billion. Those are the big surfaces. And so we're spending most of our time there, but always looking at those signals to show, are there other LLMs coming through that actually are worthwhile, including? Because from a brand perspective, it can be overwhelming. There's 7 LLMs, where do I start? And so kind of what we help do is prioritize the most important LLMs and the most important sources per brand, per category, which helps kind of prioritize and help the brand begin crawl, walk, run to start kind of taking a higher share of voice.
And beyond XEO as well, you've worked with a lot of companies, raising their EBITDA by quite significantly. When you're entering a company, where are the first, how are you auditing? What are the main frameworks and areas that you're looking at within a company to try?
Again, it typically comes back to that consumer lens. What we'll often kind of do is identify what are your channels to market. In those channels to market, what are the kind of the most important segments of your consumer or customer base, and kind of what's the profitability of each of those channels. So channel profitability often is misunderstood by a lot of businesses, meaning we thought actually kind of pushing product onto Amazon was profitable. It's not, Or it's profitable in aggregate. But if you look at your 10,000 SKUs, only 20% of the SKUs are profitable, 80% are not. And so breaking apart the problem into channels and product level profitability is often where I've begun to pinpoint. Actually, you are profitable overall, but that's an average. Your average EBIT or EBITDA is 15%. Actually, some of your channels and some of your products are super profitable, others much less so. And so breaking it apart bottom up has often been one way to begin to understand how you can grow profitability a bit further.
And why do you think that founders necessarily in their own companies aren't doing it from that bottom up lens approach?
I think it's a function of, I think, experience, and also maybe a little bit around where you gravitate towards, right? It's kind of, some people just gravitate towards specific domains, and I think not that consumer is the only domain, but often speaking to, starting with the audience, the end consumer, and working backwards can often kind of yield a lot of interesting insights.
And also alongside that, you've worked with a lot of brands, running marketing campaigns and really helping disrupt industries. When you're trying to go into a brand, and yes, you help look at all the analytics, then how you can How are you viewing it from a marketing point of view and trying to disrupt that and create campaigns for
Yeah.
this?
One of the things I've often, it's quite fun to do is ask the brand how well they think they know their audience, right? And they'll kind of tell you and you say, what's that based on? And they go, well, and it's often anecdotal. And so there's a bunch of tools out there like a test, Pullfish, and these are rapid surveys you can do. It costs you a little $100 for 100 completes, and you actually bring to a brand. Like, these are 500 completes. Actually, this is your audience saying how they regard your brand. And so often it's very valuable to bring fresh evidence to change the conversation with the brand, to maybe revisit their assumptions around whether they think this messaging is correct. It's kind of interesting. Often a brand will talk about one thing, but actually consumers are talking about something completely differently, right? And so actually speaking to consumers and bringing that insight can be very valuable. So for example, a brand we're working with sells lip gloss, right? And actually, so they talk about lip gloss, but actually the consumers talk about the stickiness of the lip gloss, right? And so actually, if you spend more time addressing that concern on is the lip gloss sticky, you could probably kind of expand your share. And so I think bringing that kind of that evidence is really kind of helpful to inform the right messaging for the marketing campaign.
And if you say a smaller branch doesn't necessarily have as many customers to talk to, and then it's weighted more heavily, how do you know whether the customer is saying like whether you should listen to that or whether it's just one voice? And if you only have 10 people, then obviously it's going to be weighted differently.
Yeah, it's funny actually, and this is definitely just a kind of I guess an observation is certainly from a qualitative perspective. I've often found if you speak to the first, second, third, fourth person in a market, for a brand, you learn a lot. But after about the seventh or eighth, the incremental tends to kind of decline. So said another way, with qualitative, you can often with like 6 or 7 kind of interviews, and you can do a bunch of these online. In fact, there's a bunch of tools now actually that uses an AI avatar to run the interview on your behalf. So it's kind of more scalable. But I think you can actually learn a lot from a relatively small group of people. You want to complement that with quantitative, but I think those two together can actually kind of like build a pretty robust picture of what's going on in a market.
And obviously you work with a lot of different brands and companies across sectors. How has that influenced or shaped the way that you've approached building your own companies?
Yeah, I think it's been funny because it's always been a little bit of grass is greener, kind of meaning I've worked for large corporates like 60, 80,000 people and startups. And often it's always, oh my God, I'm working for a large corporate. I wish I were in a more agile environment where I can make decisions myself. Then you're working in a startup, it's like, oh crap. Am I going to make it to the end of the week before I've run out of money? And so I think that there's definitely pros and cons to both, but it's definitely helpful to spend time on the other side of the fence, whatever that fence is, a different market, a different vertical, a different side of the table, and kind of like you build a much higher level of empathy once you've kind of spent time on both sides.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Kaia.